Born, please?
I was born in Belfast, and I came to Pembrokeshire in West Wales when I was about 3 weeks old. My father was a Welshman from St David's, and he came from a seafaring family. My great-grandfather was a small ship owner, sailing ships mainly. My mother was Irish, Ulster woman, and I grew up and went to school in Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire.
How old were you when you left school?
I left school at 15. I had my 16th birthday at sea. I signed indentures as an apprentice to Messrs John Corey's and Son of Cardiff, tramp steamer owners. And I spent my 16th birthday actually at sea in the Bay of Biscay.
What kind of a company was it to work for?
Oh, typical tramp steamer. It was apprentices were the lowest form of human life, of course, and we were expected to do everything. And I had to join the ship in Amsterdam. She was in dry dock in Amsterdam. And so on January the 6th or 7th, I can't remember which, 1937, I travelled by myself to Amsterdam. My great uncle was a chemist in London, and he saw me across London, looked after me. He also was a frustrated seaman. He wanted to go to sea as a boy, but his eyesight was too bad. And I arrived in Amsterdam, stayed at a boarding house, and eventually we went to sea. The shock was, of course, that in those days you were given a list of equipment to buy by the shipping company, which my parents bought for me in Cardiff. And I can remember one of the things that we had no idea what they were. They were called blucher boots, and they were a kind of leather sea boot that came up to just below the knee, solid leather with great big wooden soles. And this was part of the equipment. The other part, of course, was your uniform, apprentice's uniform, which was a square-rigged uniform with little tabs on the on the lapels. And I travelled in this. And when I arrived at the ship, which had come out of dry dock and then was being got ready for sea, I couldn't believe what I was looking at, because there I was dressed up in a smart new uniform, looking at a black hull covered in debris and dust and whatnot. And the first person I met at the top of the gangway was the boatswain, who came from Newquay, Cardigan. And he said to me, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm the new apprentice," thinking that he would salute me or something. He said, "You better get all those clothes off," he said, "because we want you down below immediately." And within about 20 minutes I was down in number 2 hold, I remember, cleaning bilges. It was not a very... I had visions of walking up and down with a telescope under my arm, sort of issuing orders, do this, do that, but I found that I soon found my niche in life there anyway, that was for sure.
What kind of trade was the Corrigan doing in those days?
She was a tramp. Mainly she'd been on the coal run from South Wales to South America. But because this was 37 and we hadn't come out of the slump properly, so we spent a fair amount of time tramping. My first voyage, in fact, was down to the west coast of Africa, up and down the coast, loading cocoa beans, palm kernels and peanuts. I'd never seen so many peanuts in bulk in my life. I couldn't believe it. And we had a crew on board then, supplied by the shipping company, by the shipping company. We shipped up an extra crew of West Africans who stayed on board for the 3 months we were on the coast. And they did all the loading, stevedoring, everything. And that was quite an eye-opener for me. I'd never I'd never experienced so many black people at close quarters.
Were they likable?
Oh yes, they were great. They ate well. The thing that I still remember well was that the man in charge, who organised the labour, was about 5'2", very wizened, very old, and he looked the least formidable. They were all big guys, and the chap who looked as though he should be the leader was built like Paul Robeson, but in fact he was the laundryman. He did all the ironing and washing. He didn't do anything else, and yet he was bigger than any of them. So I never quite sorted that out. And that's when we got introduced to what was known in those days as the crew, KR00, the crew lavatory, and that was a big plank hung over the stern of the ship on ropes. And this is where these lads used to go to the toilet.
Why was it called crew?
That was the name of the tribe, I imagine, or the group of people anyway, as crewmen. And there weren't enough lavatories on board for 60 men, enough for our own ordinary crew. And then we came back from there to Avonmouth, I think. And then we did various trips down to South America, which was quite interesting. We used to discharge coal in either Montevideo or Buenos Aires. And for a very naive 16, 17-year-old, Buenos Aires was an eye-opener. Couldn't believe it. When I think back now, fortunately for me, we didn't, as apprentices, we didn't have much money. My first year I earned £12 with overtime, which overtime was sixpence an hour, if I remember correctly. But of course, in those days, we were just coming off the situation where you had watchkeeping at 4 hours on, 4 hours off. And it had just been changed. I did one voyage like that, and then we changed to 4 hours on, 8 hours off, which was quite an innovation. But a day of sailing, you could work 10 or 12 hours before you got into the overtime bracket. So when the ship was sailing, it was 10 hours. Sundays at sea, you actually worked an extra 2 hours in the morning and 2 in the afternoon on what were known as sanitary duties. That was without overtime. That was for washing down the decks, washing paintwork, scrubbing stuff. That was part of the job. So overtime was pretty hard earned.
What do you remember about the outbreak of war?
I was coming, the ship rather, well, I was there as well. The ship was coming, we were coming from South America, bound back with a cargo of grain for London. And halfway across, a declaration, I think it was then, that war was declared, and we were diverted to Freetown to pick up the first convoy of the war for us. And I can remember the captain, who was a Captain Raymond Evans, who became quite a good friend, particularly with his family, who came also from New Quay Cardigan. He issued very strict instructions about watchkeeping, and for the first time ever, the crow's nest was used for lookout duties. But unfortunately, I picked up some kind of food poisoning in the Argentine, and halfway across, they were very concerned because by this time I was very ill. So when we got to Freetown, I was put ashore, and I spent, I think it was about 4 months in hospital in Freetown. I remember I didn't feel very well. My weight went down from about 11.5 stone to 7.5 stone in a matter of about 4 weeks. So I was very dehydrated. And I came home from there as a distressed British seaman, DBS, in one of the Pacific Steam Navigation ships. and landed in London in 1940, early 1940.
Did the outbreak of war make much difference to your status and conditions of service?
Not particularly. The main thing that happened was that seamen were given seamen's cards, and you had extra rations. I remember that well because that carried on for a long time after the war. But it didn't make a great deal. I travelled home, and all my clothing etc. had been sent on, and after, I can't remember quite, it's a long time ago, I went back to sea in the Corrigan and made another voyage down to South America, but this time the cargo was destined for New Orleans, and we went to New Orleans, which must have been the beginning of the war, because, or at least before Italy and Japan came into the war, because we were lying at a wharf in New Orleans, and ahead of us was a Japanese ship, astern of us was an Italian ship, and across the river on the other side was a German vessel, all in the same port. And there was a big fracas one night in one of the local bars when all these crew met, and suddenly they started passing comments about each other, and I wasn't actually there, but I know I saw some of our crew coming back in a pretty bad shape. They'd been involved in fights, etc. So the Americans put guards at the foot of every gangway to prevent this. And then we made a trip up through the canal, through the Panama, up to Vancouver, and from Vancouver we came back round to one of the southern port states, southern state ports. I can't remember which one, but the Americans were far stricter than we were. No matter what time you arrived in port, all the crew were turned out, everyone, watchkeepers, off watch, etc. And a thing I'd never experienced in my life before, and I'd been pretty well everywhere, you had to line up, and you were obliged to display your testicles to American It was known as a short arm inspection, to ensure that you weren't suffering from venereal disease. And I could never, it seemed a pretty primitive way of doing things, but that was what happened. No matter what time, night or day, this is what happened. So the Americans had some peculiar ideas.
Now, I think you were with the Corrigan when it was sunk.
Yes, we were coming back from St. John, Newfoundland, bound for Hull, and we'd had a very bad trip back. Some of the superstructure had been very badly strained in bad weather, and we put into Leith, which was a convoy port, to pick up a convoy to take us down the coast to some ships going to Newcastle, some to Hull, some to London. And on the way down, we ran into very dense fog, and to this day I don't know whether we hit a mine or an underwater obstruction or if we were torpedoed. No one seems to know, but I was the apprentice at the time, senior apprentice. I was calling the watch at 7:45 in the morning when there was this enormous bang, and all the air was hissing out of the goosenecks on the deck from the foredeck. the captain came up and the ship was listing slightly but not actually sinking, and he decided to beach the ship to try and save the ship and the cargo, and we beached on a long beach near Newcastle, just south of Holy Island. I don't remember the name of the place, but we were very close to Holy Island, and we managed to beach the ship. We spent most of that day putting out stern anchors to try and ensure that she didn't swing round onto the beach. The ship was about 8,000 or 9,000 tons of cargo, but during the day the weather became very bad. The lifeboat came alongside and told us that if we didn't come off then, we wouldn't get off at all. So we were landed, all of us on Holy Island. We weren't allowed to take anything with us, except maybe a small handbag with clothes in. The captain remained on the ship, Captain Evans, and he stayed on, he said, to clear up papers. We went ashore and we were put up in Holy Island, a crew of 30, I remember. The next morning, about 5 o'clock, the boatswain and I went up onto one of the headlands there to see what was happening, and by this time the ship had lost the funnel, lost the foremast, and we saw a light on the bridge, like a flashlight. And then about 11 o'clock that morning they picked the captain's body up. He'd been washed overboard, and he was found further down the coast wearing a life jacket. So we were marooned on Holy Island because it was very bad weather. It was the time of the great freeze up in the north, 1941, I think, and we couldn't get we couldn't get ashore to the mainland. When we did get ashore, we were put on a train, but it took us 24 hours to go from Beale, a small station at Holy Island's nearest railway station, to Newcastle. In fact, I seem to remember there was a newspaper report they lost the train on the Yorkshire moors completely. The whole train was lost in the snow, and they eventually found it about a day later when snow began to melt around it. So it was we had no food either on this blessed train, but we managed to get down to London, and then I came home, and I had enough sea time in to do my exams, a second mate's exam. And my mother, who was a pretty determined lady, wouldn't let me go to Cardiff, which was the nearest place for examination. She insisted I went to Belfast to my grandmother. And I studied in the Donegal School of, I forget what they call it, Donegal School of Navigation and Seamanship, that was it, run by a man called Captain Boyd, William Boyd, who was amazing. He was an amazing man. He could take second mates right through to extra masters, all the syllabus. He knew everything about it, almost single-handed, and had very few failures. I had 3 months there, but unfortunately it was the Blitz of Belfast was on at the time, and my grandparents' house was hit with an incendiary bomb, which we managed to put out before it did too much damage. But my grandparents were quite elderly, and I managed to persuade them to leave the house and go and live in some relations in the country, while I carried on in Belfast.
What was the Belfast Blitz like?
Pretty horrendous. I'd never been in a blitz before, and I would have preferred to have been at sea, I think. It was absolutely horrendous. There was virtually no let-up almost every night. It was terrible.
Which parts of the city were hit badly?
if I remember, the East End was badly hit. Some of the central areas were knocked about. And a funny thing, our next door neighbour was an Irish Republican. I've never forgotten him, Sean Connolly, who welcomed the demise of Britain, and yet whenever the bombs came, the first thing he did was rush down to the nearest church, St. Malachy's, to defend the church against fire bombs. The two things never squared up. He was on one hand wishing the Germans would win, and in the second instance cursing them for bombing his church. And it never made sense to me, that. But there you are, that's the Irishman, I suppose.
What was the address of your grandparents in Belfast?
The street is now gone. It was Joy Street, 111 Joy Street. A row of rather largish terraced houses. My grandmother was Maltese. My grandfather had been in the Royal, I think it was Royal Artillery, and he'd been stationed in Malta for many years. He married my grandmother there, and of course every time the air raid siren sounded, she would disappear to a little cubby hole under the stairs. And she, being a Catholic, she would be reciting her prayers, telling her rosary, and using she spoke about 3 languages anyway, and she'd be using all of them in order to make sure that the Lord protected the house and her from the bombing. But she was amazing. My grandfather, of course, was a very austere Ulster Protestant, and his sole occupation was preparing himself for German paratroopers, and he had 2 swords which he sharpened up every day and then left them unsheathed in various places so that if any paratroopers came, I said, what would you do with those? And he said, I'll take the heads off. He says, I said, God, pretty drastic. So he was quite a lad. He was quite a lad.
Were you brought up as a Protestant or a Catholic?
I was brought up as a Catholic, but my father was a Protestant, my mother was a Catholic. I think we were pretty liberal thinkers in our house. My father was a very free thinker, and my mother was quite a staunch Catholic. Over the years I've lapsed now.
But politically, did you stand for the Union?
I wasn't interested in politics. I could never understand quite, even today. I mean, I'm 73 now, almost 74, and I still can't come to terms with the fact that people fight with one another over what appear to be not trivial. It obviously isn't trivial, but it is so unnecessary. One thing that going to sea has taught me, and we never had any problems with it before, but if we came from a very open family, I've never had any hang-ups about colour, race, creed, anything, because every ship I've been in, we had mixed crews, and a ship, of course, is interdependent. Each man is interdependent on the other. I mean, if one man doesn't do his job, so it doesn't really matter what colour he is, or whether he's a Buddhist or a communist or a Protestant or what, it makes no difference. As long as he does his job and you get on okay together, that's fine.
Any other memories from the Belfast Blitz about public morale in the Blitz, for example?
Yeah, I hope this isn't good. This won't be libelous, I hope. But yes, in the Blitz, it was quite funny. There was a slogan daubed on a wall of a bakery. The bakery was called McWaters. I remember it well. And it was, Belfast men, run if you will, pull up your skirts and take to the hill. The hill was the Cave Hill outside Belfast, an enormous hill. And scurrilous rumour had it that whenever the air raid siren went, there was an exodus of men heading for the Cave Hill for safety. One of my other neighbours was a chap called Donaldson. He used to go swimming every day at the end of college, and then for starting studying at home. and he was an Ulsterman, and he told me that he was quite disgusted with some of the behaviour. But then, on the other hand, I never personally saw people in mass exodus out of Belfast, so I think it was just something put about by one group against another.
Which group would have done it?
Oh, I've no idea. I've no idea. But we had a mixed bunch in college with us. We had people from Dublin up there. We had people from Scotland had come across. I don't know why. And I can remember now when the examiner was a very old chap called back for wartime, called Davis. Not a Welshman, spelt the Welsh way. And he had actually come into Milford Haven in a sailing ship in his youth. And when he knew I came from Milford Haven, he immediately assumed that A, I knew how to get into Milford Haven, and B, that I was used to sailing ships. And neither, of course, was true. I didn't think very little about them anyway. So it was quite interesting. And there was very little animosity between the Dubliners and the Belfast boys. There were two crowds there. In fact, when we finished our exams, we went to a pub, the name of which I forget now. And there used to be a guy outside with one arm playing a trumpet for money. He was obviously not quite right, apart from the fact he only had one arm. And we got him in the pub on this celebration day, and after a fairly liberal session with this trumpeter guy, we got him to play a song which was presumably banned in Belfast, called the Soldier's Song. I still don't know quite why it's so treasonable, or it was in those days, I imagine, to play this thing. And this chap was drunk as a lord, playing this Soldier's Song, and everyone, both the Dubliners and these other guys singing it, and me sort of joining in, not quite knowing what I was singing. But they were good days, and not every day was bad. But
Was this next door neighbour unique in wanting the Germans to win?
oh no, his sister and I was very keen on his sister, a girl called Maureen. It's amazing how my memory goes back this far. My wife says I can't remember any damn thing today, but in there I could. And she and I went to the cinema on a number of occasions, and when they in those cinemas they used to play God Save the the King before, and she would never stand up. And I asked her one day, I said, well, what's the matter with you? You're British? She said, no, I'm Irish. And she said, I've never forgotten my father. I said, well, I knew her father. And I said, well, what's wrong with your father? Oh, she said, he did so many years in the ship. And I didn't know what she meant. I then asked my uncle, who was also at sea as an engineer. I said, what does she mean? Oh, he said, when they had the prison hulks in Belfast Harbour, they used to put these guys with doubtful patriotism in these hulks. So that is why the whole family were Republican. They were brought up, and yet the whole area was mixed. I mean, some of them were Republicans, some were very staunch. My grandmother didn't care two hoots.